Good evening, and on behalf of the director, Susan Weber, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you here for the first of this year's Leon Levy Foundation Lectures in Jewish Material Culture. I'd like to welcome all of you here in the room, those of you watching on VGC TV, both now and at some point in the future. And as we are on West 86th Street in Manhattan, Manhattan, I would also, on behalf of the VGC, like to acknowledge that our institutional life unfolds on the ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape people. This Leon Levy Foundation lecture series is sponsored by the Leon Levy Foundation and also with assistance from the David Berg Foundation. I'd like to thank both of them very much. Last year, when we launched the series, we introduced it as fulfilling the hope set forth in 1926 by the Hungarian scholar Ludwig Blau, publishing in an American journal, the Hebrew Union College Annual, where he called for the creation of a Jewish archaeology, the study of the Jewish material past. And he explicitly modeled this call on the Christian archaeology of the late 16th century, part of the antiquarian revival of the study of ancient Rome through its material remains. That article was actually entitled Early Christian Archaeology from the Jewish Point of View. And this year we're actually going right back to 1926. We're continuing in some sense with the topic launched in our first series by Andrea Berlin last fall, who looked at the period in Judea and Palestine from the Hellenistic period really up to the first century, and with this year's series we're going to be continuing from really the second century on into later antiquity. In a way, this year's series also models something that we could call applied late Wittgenstein. And this will say a lot about Professor Weiss's lecture method, but also about the Berg Graduate Center. What I mean by that, Wittgenstein, as you may know, in the 1930s, challenged those who believed that language was a transparent container where words applied exactly, denoting objects in the world in an unproblematic way. And his point was that far from being transparent, language had a history of its own, and to say anything useful about the world using language, one had to first be aware of the interference, so to speak, that language creates, and study how it is that the terms acquired the meanings that they did. And that was the first step towards saying anything meaningful about the world. And from that, we can really take away the fact that, from our point of view, questions about the world, questions about the past, don't exist out there in the past. They don't exist as if having trees to be plucked. Questions themselves have a history. And to work in a scholarly literature means being aware of that history. And that's the first step towards saying anything useful in any scholarly field. And this year's series is exactly modeling this process. So, Eleazar, Sukenik, the beginning of archaeology in mandatory Palestine, is really the beginning, to go back to the beginnings of archaeology in the 20th century in Palestine and then in Israel, to look at the way the categories for the study developed. That'll be this first lecture. The second lecture will examine some of the important findings in the areas of material culture, and the third lecture will look at the future and what an understanding of no longer Jewish archaeology from a Christian point of view can give us, but in fact, starting from proper understanding of the questions, in fact, what kinds of new discoveries can be made. The person who will take us on this trip, Zeev Weiss, is the Eleazar Sukenik Professor of Archaeology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, an institution from which he received his BA, MA, and PhD degrees. He has been a visiting professor at Princeton, at the Maison Méditerranéenne des Sciences de l'Homme in Aix-en-Provence, and at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris, as well as a visiting fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, just across the park. Since 1990, he's been the director of the excavations at Sepphoris in Galilee, and his book, The Sepphoris Synagogue, Deciphering an Ancient Message Through Its Archaeological and Socio-Historical Contexts, which was published in 2005, won the Irene Levy Salah Book Prize in the Archaeology of Israel. He has also published a book on the mosaics in the House of Dionysus at Sepphoris in 2004, and in 2014, Harvard University Press published his book, Public Spectacles in Roman and Late Antique Palestine. He's also been the author of many, many articles focusing on Jewish art, Jewish iconography, and Jewish buildings in later antiquity. And on top of all the scholarship, at the Hebrew University has trained 13 master's students and 10 doctoral students. So it's a great pleasure to invite Zeev Weiss to the podium, and I think it will be a great treat for all of us to listen to what he has to say.
Thank you, Peter, for this warm welcoming. It all started 3 years ago. I got an email from Peter asking for advice about a program we would like to launch here at Berg. We were placing emails. At one point I told him, Peter, I'm going to be in New York on sabbatical at ISO. We should meet. And we met, not far from here. We spoke. At one point, tell me, Zeev, I want you to come. And here I am. Thanking you for the offer, for the opportunity, for being here, and also working on things that I've been interested for a long time to work on, and that's really a good opportunity to do. So to my lecture. The exploration of ancient remains in the land of Israel began in the mid-19th century, although formal excavations and surveys by foreign institutions in Jerusalem were conducted only a few decades later and increased significantly after World War I, when Palestine became a British mandate. Fernandez Petrie was the first archaeologist to conduct stratigraphical excavation from 1890 to 1894 at Tel El-Hessi on behalf of the Palestine Exploration Fund, and was followed by others who worked on other sites throughout the region. Most of the research at this time was conducted by Christian scholars who focused mainly on biblical archaeology and were influenced by the extensive excavation that took place concurrently in Egypt and Mesopotamia. In the early 20th century, the interest in Jewish monuments was limited to the study of ancient synagogues only, such as survey and excavation of several Galilean synagogues conducted by Heinrich Kohl and Karl Watzinger between 1905 and 1907, or random discoveries of synagogues after World War I. In 1918, Louis Vincent at the French École Biblique in Jerusalem excavated the synagogue at Naharan, and 3 years later, Nahum Sluch, the first Jewish archaeology of the land of Israel, uncovered the synagogue at Hamat Tiberias on behalf of what was formerly known as Jewish Palestine Exploration Society, and now is called Israel Exploration Society. These discoveries, alongside surveys conducted in the Galilee in the 19th century, provided important first-hand information about Jewish life in late antique Palestine. The desire to reconstruct and evaluate the physical and social cultural settings mirrored by texts and the information embedded in them had led scholars from various disciplines to study in depth these realms of Jewish expression in antiquity. In the pioneering studies of Shmuel Kreuz, his monumental 3-volume Talmudic Archaeology published from 1910 to 1912, and his Synagogue Altitum published in 1922, focused primarily on rebuilding literary sources and occasionally illustrated his discussions with archaeological remains to contextualize Jewish cultural life in ancient Palestine within the larger framework. The first steps in the study of Jewish material culture were taken in the early 20th century by several European scholars. However, in a review article from 1926, Peter just mentioned it, dedicated Jewish influences on early Christian monuments, Ludwig Blau indicated that Jewish archaeology as a field of study and research did not exist in any institution in his day. Nor was any professional archaeologist who was, and I'm quoting, familiar with the ancient monuments together with Jewish literary sources. Eleazar Sukenik, who is the focus of today's lecture, may not have been the first to conceive of the idea or of the need to develop the field of Jewish archaeology, but he should certainly be considered as the founder of this discipline. Through his early academic career at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Sukenik laid the foundation for Jewish archaeology and expanded its parameters. His various studies filled vacuum prevailing at the time in understanding Jewish life in the land of Israel and the Jewish diaspora. Born in Białystok, Poland in 1889, Eleazar Sukenik grew up in a religiously observant Jewish family. After completing his elementary education in Cheder, at the age of 13, he spent 3 years in 2 yeshivot, one in Lomża, Poland, and the other in Slobodka, Lithuania. He immigrated to Palestine in 1911, and after receiving his teaching certificate in 1913, he taught for several years at the Hebrew School for Boys in Jerusalem. During those years, he toured the country and published a guide for Jerusalem and its surroundings, together with Chaim Aryeh Zuta, who was a writer and a teacher too. Sukenik was eager to study and specialized in the land of Israel studies, as well as classical and Jewish archaeology. He pursued his academic education in several institutions, but for the most part was a diligent, self-taught, dedicated scholar. From 1992 to 1923, he studied classical archaeology and Semitic languages at the University of Berlin. Upon his return to Jerusalem, he studied with William Foxwell Albright at the American School of Oriental Research and with Louis Givenson of the École Biblique. And in May 1926, at the age of 37, he received his doctorate at Drexel College in Philadelphia. Although his dissertation, The Ancient Palestinian Synagogues, written partially in Hebrew and partially in English, was never published in the original form, the results of his research seem to have served him in his later studies. After returning to Jerusalem in 1926, he became a field archaeologist at the newly founded Institute of Jewish Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a position he held until September 1934, when he became a lecturer in archaeology of the land of Israel from early Bronze Age throughout Byzantine period. Sukenik made important strides during those early years at the university, conducting surveys and excavations and publishing archaeological finds, ultimately gaining international recognition and status as a leading archaeologist. In June 1937, the Senate of the Hebrew University appointed him professor, and a year later honored him with a special chair dedicated to the archaeology of the land of Israel. In the years before the establishment of the State of Israel, Sukenik continued his academic research and devoted his time to building the Hebrew University academic program in archaeology, to establish the Department of Archaeology, and especially to the construction of the Museum of Jewish Antiquities, Bet HaNechot L'Atikot HaYehudim, And this is the picture taken in the early 40s, and the original sign, בית המכות לעתיקות היהודים, is still there on the building. The identification of the Dead Sea Scrolls as the writings of the Essenes at Qumran and their importance to the study of Second Temple Judaism marked the peak in Sukenik's academic career in his later years. Now more than ever before, his investigation of the Dead Sea Scrolls earned him wide recognition and high regard both in Israel and abroad. In 1951, he was the first scholar at the Hebrew University to receive the prestigious Salomon Bublik Award for the academic achievements in the study of the Dead Sea Scrolls. 2 years later, in 1954, he passed away at the age of 64. Sukenik's archaeological interests were broad, and the subjects of his research were equally diverse, from Chalcolithic throughout biblical periods. He conducted various excavations and participated in others, including those at Tel Jerishet, Tel Kudade, Jerusalem, Fula, Hadera, as well as Samaria, Sebastia, where he was a co-director on behalf of the Hebrew University in a joint expedition with Harvard University, the British School of Archaeology, and Palestine Exploration Fund. His main interest, however, was Jewish archaeology from the Second Temple period throughout late antiquity, dedicating much of his career to the study of ancient synagogues, Jewish burial, epigraphy, numismatic, and Dead Sea Scrolls, aided by his young and devoted assistant, Nachman Reis, known later as the world-renowned archaeologist Professor Nachman Avigad. Sukenik attained significant achievements in various fields, some of which were considered a breakthrough in his day. In order to assess Sukenik's contribution to the study and research of Jewish archaeology, we should first define the term Jewish archaeology. Keeping in mind that physical remains and material objects can tell much about the past, the study of Jewish archaeology, or Jewish material culture as it's referred to today, focuses on the analysis of monuments, work of art, and crafts in Jewish Rome. However, when their study is combined with contemporary Jewish religious sources, it is possible to reconstruct and gain an understanding of Jewish life in the Roman and Byzantine world. Influenced by the concepts of Christian archaeology, Ludwig Blau, whom I mentioned earlier, proposed in his 1926 article to establish the study of Jewish archaeology in a similar format in the United States, where it has at its disposal the means and the teaching staff. Blau's appeal did not materialize in the United States, but took form in Jerusalem in the spirit of Sukenik vision. The desire to develop the study of Jewish archaeology arose in the early stage of Sukenik's career, only a few years after he began his survey of the Galilean synagogues, and after conducting several excavations on behalf of the Hebrew University. On July 12, 1928, Sukenik notes in his journal that, and I'm quoting, "There is important work ahead of me, namely the creation of Jewish archaeology." And a few weeks later, he took his first steps toward the goal he set to himself. In August 1929, Sukenik sent 2 successive letters to Dr. Yehuda Leib Magnus, the first chancellor of the Hebrew University. In the first letter, he complained about his colleagues' lack of interest in Jewish remains, which may explain why most of the research in this regard was being conducted by non-Jews. In the second letter, he suggested, without going into details, but promising, to elaborate later on, and I mark it on the screen, that the Hebrew University should specifically offer the study of Jewish archaeology alongside archaeology of the land of Israel, and that the need to establish a center for this discipline at the Hebrew University has been long felt. 4 months later, in mid-December in 1928, Sukenik asked to provide Dr. Magnus with a memorandum he had promised regarding the relationship between the Hebrew University and Jewish archaeology. And again, I mark it on screen. 10 days later, on December 27, 1928, Sukenik sent Magnus a long letter in which he expressed for the first time his vision regarding the establishment of the Department of Jewish Archaeology at the Hebrew University. He opens his letter by saying, and that's the first row on the page on the right, one of the important roles in Jewish research that the university must assume is the creation of the Department of Jewish Archaeology. He goes on to write, the remains of our past can shed much light on understanding several obscure episodes in the scriptures and the cultural life of our people in various periods. He further claims that the Hebrew University is the most capable institution to undertake such mission due to its geographical location and the presence of other scholars engaged in related fields. Sukenik then lists the 3 areas comprising Jewish archaeology and relay and elaborate on the study of each. 1. Archaeological remains, and here refer to settlements, synagogues, necropolis, receptacles, coins, etc. 2. Epigraphy, and here refers to ancient Jewish inscriptions in various languages. And 3. Resources, vis-a-vis archaeological finds, and here again he refers to biblical and Talmudic literature together. Furthermore, according to the ambitious plan he presented to Magnus, the study of Jewish archaeology should not be confined to the boundaries of the land of Israel, but should include the entire Jewish diaspora in antiquity, in the marked areas: Babylonia, Egypt, Syria, Italy, Greece, Asia Minor, and North Africa. This is to be accompanied by collection and display of objects or replicas of objects in the museum that will be established in conjunction with the department. In this remarkable document, written between the 2 world wars, Sukenik described in detail the actions to be taken in each and every region, without even knowing that the urban borders in his day would be largely closed to Jews in less than a decade. Sukenik's objectives concerning Jewish archaeology were brought to the attention of the general public in an interview published in Haaretz newspaper in March 1931. He formulated his ideas once again in a document he distributed on February 18, 1936, after Daliah Morris Kutcher of South Africa had bequeathed his estate to the Hebrew University for the purpose of establishing a museum of Jewish antiquities. Sukenik envisions a museum that would have 4 major galleries: historical and epigraphy, art and architecture, relics of everyday Jewish life, and other antiquities of the land of Israel. That, and I'm quoting, is apt to become the world center for all those who are interested in the relics of the Jewish nation. In a modest ceremony held at the inauguration of the museum on April 3, 1941, Sukenik again presented his vision for the museum. He spoke about what had been done in the meanwhile to implement his plan and outline what had to be done in the future. Sukenik Memorandum became the official proposition of the university. Magnus referred it in a letter written in Hebrew and sent in Hebrew on January 31, 1929 to Nelson Glick, a faculty member and biblical archaeologist
at the Hebrew Union College, Cincinnati, saying that, and I'm quoting, "It is the aim of a university to create the conditions and supply the materials for what might be known as Jewish archaeology. But inasmuch as there are other agencies at work on other phases of archaeology, the Hebrew University regards it as a prime function to do as much as possible in direction of Jewish archaeology." This notion found expression once again in an official statement issued by the Hebrew University on November 25, 1933, announcing in addition that, and I marked it on screen, a chair for Jewish archaeology at the Hebrew University is considered one of the great desiderata awaiting endowment. In a short brochure entitled The Value of Jewish Archaeology to Jewry of Today, published in 1947 by the American Friends of the Hebrew University, Sukenik explained 2 decades later the essence of Jewish archaeology and why it was so important in his generation. I'm quoting, "Archaeological discoveries are not only concern of scholars. They may be turned into chapters of life closely linked between us and the past. A link that enables us to visualize the past as well as touch it and feel it." End of quote. It provides information and brings to life the remains of Jewish past, denotes the link between Judaism and Christianity, enrich the study of literary sources, and could serve, in addition, the proper cultural guidance for our youth, who are desperately in need of communicating with their past. Archaeology was first taught at the Hebrew University in a limited capacity in 1928 as part of the Institute of Jewish Studies. However, Sukenik's vision was realized only in 1936 with the establishment of study program that combined both general and Jewish archaeology, at first as a minor and from 1937 on as a major. The curriculum was mixed, offering courses in archaeology of the land of Israel, Jewish archaeology, and epigraphy, as well as other subjects that provided a background to the study of ancient Near East, as well as Greco-Roman and Islamic world. By establishing the research discipline of Jewish archaeology at the Hebrew University, Sukenik placed a great deal of weight on excavations and the publication of finds associated with Jewish realm in both the land of Israel and the diaspora. The scope of Sukenik's academic achievements and their contribution to the study of Jewish archaeology in the early days of the Hebrew University can be best demonstrated by describing his studies on burial customs, epigraphy, and ancient synagogues. Jewish burial practices in the Second Temple period are known primarily from the various burial places uncovered in Jerusalem and its environs. Primary burials were for the most part situated on a family estate in rock-cut caves containing burial niches, locally in Latin or kochim in Hebrew, which differed in number from cave to cave. When it became necessary to bury another member of the family in the tomb, the bones of those who had died earlier were removed from the loculus, collected, and placed in stone ossuary, a process called oscilligium. The ossuary was at times decorated with stylized rosettes, other floral motifs, or with architectural features carved in soft stones or painted on the surface in red. Short inscriptions in Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek mentioning the name of the deceased were sometimes incised or scratches inside the burial place, or more often on the long side of the ossuary, and you can see here one example. Sukenik's interest in the Jerusalem necropolis was sparked in 1924 when he conducted his first excavation of a rock-cut tomb on the university's Mount Scopus campus and published several short articles on its ossuaries and inscriptions. In the following years, he excavated several other tombs containing ajuries and documented a few more decorated ajuries. Some have engraved inscriptions which were stored in the Department of Antiquities of the Government of Palestine, in monasteries and other institutions in the city. On his way back from London in 1931, and it's after he gave the Schweich lecture, which I mentioned later on, Sukenik delivered a paper in the invitation of the Berlin Archaeological Society in German, and the title in English is Jewish Burial in Jerusalem in Time of Jesus, in which he discussed the results of his recent investigations. Besides presenting the rock-cut tombs uncovered in Jerusalem and reviewing Jewish burial customs in late Second Temple period, he focused primarily on the ajuries and their inscriptions, including the one bearing the name Yoshua, son of Yosef, Yeshu Bar Yosef. Sukenik was cautious in his presentation, claiming that these names were quite common in the Second Temple period, and that there is no proof that this specific name could be linked to any historical figure. Nevertheless, as you can see on the paperclip on the right, his paper caused a worldwide stir that required an official response from the Hebrew University. In the years that followed, Sukenik expanded his research, and from 1934 he received permission from the Department of Antiquities of the Government of Palestine to explore the numerous rock-cut tombs in the vicinity of Kfar HaShiloach, known today as the village of Silwan, east of Jerusalem. Over 30 tombs in various parts of the city uncovered by Sukenik until 1946 significantly expanded his corpus. Each tomb was fully excavated, documented, and photographed. The distinctive ajuries were removed for further study, while others were left in the cave that had been sealed off after Sukenik completed his work, and there's a special reason for that. One such tomb, containing two burial chambers connected by courtyard, was uncovered in 1932 west of British Military Cemetery on Mount Scopus. And whoever knows Mount Scopus, it's somewhere around the Hadassah Hospital, which is right next to this burial place. 23 ajuries were found in the main hall of the tomb, which appear on the left. Most of them were located inside the locally. Nearly half of them were decorated and few bore inscriptions, mostly of private names. 2 names incised on different ajuries: Shimon Boton, reminiscent of the Greek name Boheton, and Martha's, that's the second ajury, down here, led Sukenik to assume that the tomb was owned by a Jewish priest associated with the Baitos family, whose father came from Alexandria and was appointed high priest by Herod the Great in 23 BCE. The depiction of what seems to be an altar incised beneath the name Boton, and that's on the right over there, is also carved on the ajury itself. Further supports his assumption. Another tomb located on the eastern slope of Wadi Salach on the Kidron Valley contained a square courtyard beside the chamber containing 9 locally, 2 of which contain 5 ajuries. See the plan over there. Above one locally, Sukenik uncovered unique 4-line inscriptions in Aramaic painted in red, and it reads, "These locals were made for the bones of our fathers. Its length is 2 cubits, and it should not be opened on them." The inscription marked the loculus that had been prepared for the fathers, most probably the parents of the family, and warned against its further use by moving the bones of the interred into ajuries. The warning against opening tombs also appear in a few other inscriptions in Jerusalem, and Sukenik rightly argued that it seems to reflect a widespread practice in the southern Levant. In February 1931, while searching for archeries in Jerusalem, Sukenik found one of his most important epigraphical discoveries in Jewish history in his day. A limestone plaque, it's about 35 by 34 centimeters, found ex situ and kept in the Antiquities collection of the Russian Orthodox Church on Mount of the Olives, bears an Aramaic inscription that Sukenik believed referred to the place where the bones of Uzziah, biblical king of Judah, were transferred and deposited. The inscriptions appear to have been fixed above the tomb, whose location is unknown, but most probably constructed outside the city limits. Doubts about the authenticity of the inscription were raised after its first publication, but Sukenik's suggestion to date it to the late 1st century BCE or early 1st century CE, based primarily on the paleography, language formulation, and dress of stone, was accepted by most scholars at this time. In the early 30s, the German Archaeological Institute in Berlin offered to publish Sukenik's volume on Jewish archeries, and despite the Nazis' rise to power, they were still willing to publish it in late 1936. Although the book was never published, parts of the original manuscripts in German are kept at the Hebrew University Institute of Archaeology on Mount Scopus, including Sukenik table of contents in Hebrew for 7 chapters with some German terminology. And that's the original page and translation of the chapters here on right. Although Sukenik's book was never published, his later published articles on Jerusalem necropolis demonstrate his acumen as both archaeologist and epigraphist and contribute greatly to the pioneering study of Jewish archaeology. Sukenik devoted much attention to the study of synagogue, the central institution of Jewish community in ancient Palestine and diaspora. A key innovation in the synagogue building that was maintained throughout history was the creation of a roofed and illuminated space designed to house the members of the Jewish community who actively participated in the ritual, and in some places sat on benches built against the walls of the building's main hall. The remains of several such buildings were studied before his time, and few even were excavated. But Sukenik had also made great strides in the study of the architecture, art, liturgy, and epigraphy of this institution in his surveys, excavations, lectures, and publications. He even launched a bulletin dedicated to the study of ancient synagogue after the university received a generous donation in 1949 to establish the Louis M. Rabinovich Fund for the Exploration of Ancient Synagogue. Sukenik began his survey of synagogues in the Galilee and the Golan in mid-1920s. In the spring of 1927, he joined an expedition to the land of Aegina, near Piraeus, Greece, and supervised the excavation of the synagogue there. However, his most significant breakthrough occurred when, in December 1928, a member of Kibbutz Bet Alpha knocked on the door of his home in Jerusalem and told him that in course of digging an irrigation channel, they came across a mosaic floor. After receiving an excavation permit on behalf of the Hebrew University, Sukenik began digging on January 10, 1929, exactly 90 years ago. And within a few weeks he exposed a fascinating mosaic floor that has proved to be one of the greatest finds of his time and has posed a great challenge to the study of Jewish art and archaeology. The synagogue at Bel Alpha, dated to the early 6th century CE, is located on the eastern side of the Jezreel Valley, not far from Beit She'an. Its architectural layout resembles that of a church having a forecourt and narthex to its north. The main hall, you can see it over here, has a basilical plan of 2 aisles flanking both sides of a nave, and a ritual focus, comprising an apse and a bima at its south end, which also determined the direction of prayer towards Jerusalem. The entire building was paved with a fully preserved colorful mosaic. Geometrical designs adorn the aisles, narthex, and courtyard, and the mosaic carpet in the nave boasts 3 panels featuring figurative images. A zodiac dominates the center of the carpet. An architectural facade with Jewish symbols appear close to the bima, that's at the top of the picture. And a scene of biblical Akedah, binding of Isaac, is beneath the zodiac, is located near to the entrance. 2 inscriptions right at the bottom of the picture were located opposite the entrance. The one in Aramaic dates the building to the reign of Justin I, early 6th century, and the other in Greek mentioned the 2 craftsmen who made the mosaic, Marianos and his son Hanina. While the excavation was in progress, Sukenik informed Magnus of his latest discoveries and issued a weekly communique that was officially released by the Hebrew University. The news spread, and many visitors from near and far came to witness these exceptional finds from Beth Alpha Synagogue. The building's plan and the date of construction were great importance in and of themselves, but its fame was due primarily to the scarcely damaged colorful mosaic featuring 3 figurative panels in the main hall. Together with the finds from Nahran and Gerasa, it demonstrated for the first time that Jews decorated their synagogues with biblical themes, and that iconographic sources of early Christian art may have appeared in Jewish realm preceding it. In April 1929, Sukenik was invited to present his finds at the Centennial Conference of the German Archaeological Society. Images of the mosaic were exhibited that year in Tel Aviv and London, accompanied by lectures delivered by Sukenik. The Museum of the University of Pennsylvania approached the Hebrew University that same year and expressed its desire to purchase the mosaic and place it on display with other finds from Beit She'an. That's the letter on the left. However, on the right, the offer was politely rejected. 3 years later, in 1932, Sukenik excavated another synagogue, this time at El Hama, known today as Hamat Gader, a suburb of Gadara, famous for its hot spring and located south of the Sea of Galilee and east of Jordan River. The building, dated by Sukenik to the 5th century, has a basilical plan. Its floors are embellished with colorful mosaics, mostly geometrical, and with 5 Aramaic inscriptions, only 4 of which has been preserved, and 2 of them you can see here on right. In the years between the excavation of the 2 synagogues at Bet Alpha and Hamat Gader, Sukenik solicited Magnus with an ambitious request to excavate the other synagogues. He suggested completing excavation at some synagogues and conducting a full-scale excavations in other. His request did not materialize, but he was able to continue with his survey and documentation of synagogue buildings in the Galilee and Golan, including Kfar Nahum, Erafid, Dike, and Churvat Shura. Sukenik excavated 2 additional synagogues, both adorned with mosaics that were partially preserved. In 1949, he excavated the synagogue at Salbit, that's on the left, southeast of Ramle, not far from Ben Gurion Airport. And in 1950, he uncovered the building at Yafia, near Nazareth. That's in the Galilee. Following his research of ancient synagogue and especially his important discovery at Bet Alpha, Sukenik was invited by the British Academy in 1930 to deliver 3 lectures on ancient synagogue in Palestine and Greece at the prestigious Schweich Lecture Series in Biblical Archaeology. These lectures were incorporated in his comprehensive book on synagogues in Palestine and Greece, published by the British Academy in 1934. In it, he outlined in detail and for the first time the development of Jewish institutions in the first centuries of the Common Era, while using the archaeological evidence compiling up to his day. He argued that the Galilean synagogue, like Kfar Nahum, represent an earlier group of buildings constructed in Roman times, and that later on, in the Byzantine period, a new model of building resembling the Christian basilica was favored. He maintained that the preference for the building over the other reflect new approaches in planning and decorating the synagogue, as well as liturgical needs that developed over time. He supplemented his discussion with other issues pertaining to the ancient synagogue: location, orientation, liturgical furniture, and ornamentation, and ended with an appendix containing information about synagogue's discoveries since he delivered his lecture 4 years earlier. In 1932 and 1935, Sukenik published 2 volumes documenting his excavation at Bet Alpha and Hamad Gader. The 1934 Schweich lecture volume just mentioned is a comprehensive analysis of ancient synagogues and its art, and placed the 2 synagogues in their wider context. These 3 volumes exhibit the most up-to-date archaeological finds at the time, and together with his other articles, they display his overall approach to the study of ancient synagogue. They testify to Sukenik's definition of the synagogue's architectural layout, the building's development from Roman to Byzantine period, and the changes that transpired there with the introduction of a permanent Torah ark into the prayer hall, and their origin, meaning, and relationship of synagogal Jewish art, including biblical themes, to early Christian art. Moreover, he deciphered the Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew inscriptions found in these buildings and evaluated their importance to the study of Jewish communal life in late antique Palestine. Upon the invitation of Professor Clark Hopkins of Yale University, Sukenik visited the 3rd century Dura synagogue on the Euphrates in northern Syria in March 1934, where the famous wall painting with biblical themes were discovered. He returned home with small souvenir: 3 decorated ceiling tiles from Dura Europus, and also got permission to publish an overview of the synagogue, which appeared in his 1933 book. Sukenik devoted several articles to the study of Dura Europus synagogue, but at the same time wrote a comprehensive study in German on the synagogue's impressive wall paintings. In July 1937, he signed a contract to publish his volume with Sukenik Publishing in Berlin, but because of the outbreak of the Second World War, the book unfortunately never saw light. After the war, in 1947, he published an expanded Hebrew version of the same book in Jerusalem. It vividly describes the paintings and offers his interpretation of the panels based on a careful reading of the biblical text, and as in his other studies, gives prominence to the relevant rabbinic literature. His finding led him to conclude, contrary to what he had first claimed, that the cycle of biblical depictions at Dura Europus was intended to portray the important stories representing the historical covenant familiar to the congregants of the synagogue, and that their existence at such an early date in Jewish circles demonstrate unequivocally that they served as a source of inspiration for ancient Christian art. In conclusion, Professor Eleazar Sukenik embarked on his quest to reveal physical remnants of Jewish society in antiquity with little means, little support, and minimal academic status. Nevertheless, he was determined to attain his goal to bringing Jewish archaeology to the Hebrew University as a formal field of study. Although he immigrated to Palestine in 1911 to fulfill his Zionist dream of returning to the land of Israel, there is nothing in his journals, letters, or publication to suggest that his interest in Jewish archaeology and the desire to establish this new discipline, the Hebrew University, were related in any way to the circumstances that uprooted him from Bialystok, Poland, and led him to settle in Jerusalem. Sukenik reasons for coming to Palestine are the same as those of all other scholars at the newly founded university. But his interest in archaeology and his vision to fill the vacuum in archaeological study of the land of Israel was solely his. He sought to uncover the remnants of Jewish society as an academic endeavor and believed that Jewish scholars should engage in exposing their Jewish heritage in ancient Palestine and the diaspora. Sukenik's work undoubtedly highlighted the importance of exploring and evaluating the Jewish remains scattered throughout the land of Israel. Over the years, he was involved in diverse projects and became extremely productive in various fields of study, such as the Jerusalem necropolis, Jewish epigraphy, synagogues, numismatics, and above all, Dead Sea Scrolls. According to Sukenik, Jewish archaeology touches upon all those monuments and objects that show clear and decisive evidence as having been owned and used by Jews from biblical times throughout late antiquity. To ascertain the meaning of Jewish usage, Sukenik employed several methodological tools but relied primarily on explicit signifiers such as artistic representations, symbols, epigraphy, and paleography, as well as custom unique to Jewish people. Sukenik complemented his studies with reference from rabbinic literature, knowing that the integrative analysis of archaeological finds with literary sources can illuminate, illustrate, and contextualize Jewish life in ancient Palestine and diaspora. The results were impressive, mainly because for the first time archaeological finds provided a broad perspective of Jewish life and cultural behavior from late Second Temple period and throughout late antiquity. Over the years, Sukenik attained worldwide recognition and established a distinguished reputation at the Hebrew University. He founded the Department of Archaeology, directed the Museum of Jewish Antiquities, headed the academic committee of the Encyclopedia Biblica, and was aptly dubbed the founder of Jewish archaeology. His vision of documenting Jewish life around the Mediterranean basin had not fully materialized, probably due to the horrific wars in Europe and Palestine. And yet, his decisive contribution to the study of Jewish archaeology is unequivocally. My next lecture will present a major innovation in the study of Jewish material culture in the years following the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, and will focus mainly on the latest decades of the 20th century. It will examine what had been done in the field since Sukenik's day and explore commonly held perceptions in current research that are significant for reconstructing Jewish life in Roman and late antique Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zeev. I think we have some time for questions, please. Yes?
You didn't really mention his relationship, say, with politicians, but it's hard not to think that he must have had ideas about this budding field and its contribution to creation of the State of Israel and that kind of thing. So was there ever a kind of nationalistic tone to any of the work? I mean, just purely neutral scholarship.
And within the university, I mean, he had the correspondence that he had with the chancellor. It's amazing. It's so interesting. I don't think such a phenomenon exists in any university of the world where a professor has a close contact and on daily correspondence, weekly correspondence with the chancellor. But that's really show how archaeology was important at that time. But otherwise, he had connection with other people, but not so much on academic level. I mean, it was really focused, and my work on Sukenik was really to emphasize the importance of his work in establishing the field of Jewish archaeology.
So if I can just follow up with that. I mean, the story that you told is a success story. And sitting in this room, the goal of reading objects and texts together makes perfect sense. But the Hebrew University, as you know, is an institution known as a text-centered institution. So I'm curious if you could say a little bit about the resistance to Sukenik in the university and why this approach never became the dominant one.
There was a big opposition. And if you read, I mean, none of those people live anymore. And I must say that before I came into the archive, I had a certain perception on professor in the early history of the university, and then different approach. And the way, I mean, it was not respected. It was not respected mainly because they didn't really understand what he did, and they were really text-oriented. I mean, for most of the professors at the Institute for Jewish Studies in the 20s and 30s, the text was the only thing. And that's why, for example, it took a long time till he received a position, real position. He was hired, I mean, from 1926 to 1934, he was hired on a yearly basis as an external scholar. And it's not that they did not, I mean, some people did not try to get him a real position, but he wasn't able to go through the, what we call the tenure track. And it took time till they realized that he really has something in his work. And then he got the position. But it's also, I mean, looking on the longer term, it's very interesting because at one point, not only became a member of the Institute for Jewish Studies, he was also the head of the institute. That also indicate the change of relation with Sukenik and with the people over there. So it's true, it was a long process, but I think it mainly because the humanities, and I don't know how it goes elsewhere, but sometimes some people do feel that even today, I mean, the material culture is less respected compared to text studies, and I think it's a problem. But it's interesting in terms of the university, early history of the university. Yes, please.
Obviously, his target period started right at the end of what would have been the Old Testament period. And I'm wondering, during that same period, were there others who were looking a couple hundred years further back and using the Old Testament as either a field guide or using what they found as proof of what was in the Bible?
First of all, I mean, the title of the series of my lecture is really focusing on Jewish material culture.
Sure.
And I'm focusing on the time from late Second Temple.
Late Second Temple, yeah.
Sukenik was also what we call today a biblical archaeologist, and he excavated in several sites, and he also published articles on various issues. I mean, you have to know that in the late 20s and early 30s, there was only one archaeologist doing biblical archaeology and classical archaeology. Then there was one person who did Meyer, who did Islamic archaeology. And then sometimes in the late 30s or early 40s, they got a prehistorian. So you're talking about, I mean, you don't talk about large departments. I mean, he was the man over there, did everything. But I mean, in terms of interest and focus, it was really interesting. I think much more in Jewish.
Jewish than Israeli, early Israel.
Yes, please.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you're saying about the kind of resistance that Sukenik met in the academic institution, because you think about archaeology developing during this time in Palestine and later Israel is really like the national hobby and an amateur, passion of people, and you find these little museums on kibbutzim all around the country. And I wonder what was Sukenik's response to the kind of fad for archaeology among amateurs, and if there was popular reception of his work at the time.
I mean, first of all, you have to divide between the early time and after the establishment of the State of Israel. And I'll talk about it next week. One of the things that Sukenik really did from the beginning, it was traveling around the country. I mean, there was just, what we call today Israel, it was British mandate, and there are all sorts of settlements in the Galilee, in Jezreel Valley, and he walked through those settlements, met settlers, and at one point, that's really in the early history, when he excavated in Afula. Afula is located in the Jezreel Valley in the mid-20s, and it's a biblical site. I don't think he really gained much there. And on evenings, he went to the settlements, to the kibbutzim, and gave lectures. And he told them, if you find something, come to me. And they did. Again, he was the only person of the government. There were also British archaeologists and other foreign archaeologists. But he had the contacts with the kibbutznikim, with the settlers, and he urged them to announce anything that they find or they see and come and tell him. So, I don't know how much enthusiastic those people were in the early days, and you cannot compare it to what happened after 1948. It's a different story. But I think in his journal, he do write, when he excavated Bet Alpha, he did write something that they're becoming interested in what they find. But on the other hand, for them it was a waste of time, because they didn't have time to work in the excavations. They need to grow the field. They need to work. So it's a different period. It's very hard to assess. But on the other hand, when they presented the images at Tel Aviv, Bet Alpha, and a sort of exhibition of pictures from the Bet Alpha synagogue, it was crowded. And he gave lectures and it was crowded. So there was a really interest in archaeology, but I can't call it a golden age or something that really attracted thousands of people, because it's very hard to assess. There's not enough information. But on that, it's really, on the other hand, if you go through the newspapers, you see the level of details that they give into archaeology and how they focus in archaeology. So they're like building the interest. Something that being built, where after 48 it's becoming something much bigger. Yes. Oh, sorry.
What? Sharon and then Casper.
So I was very intrigued when you mentioned that he had studied 2 years in Slobodka and 1 year in Lomzha, and those are on the hierarchy of Lithuanian yeshivas in Europe. Those are pretty high up. Did you come across any information about what that moment was when he sort of said, well, okay, I'm done with this and I'm going on to something radically different?
It's a good question. It's a really good question. I don't remember coming across anything that I think at one point he erased the early history. I think he came with the knowledge, being able to read rabbinic literature.
Aramaic.
That's definitely. He was
grounded.
Definitely. But I don't remember reading things that really relate to the early history in those in Cheder. I think he really dropped everything. Yes, and in Jerusalem there's no reference to anything, nothing. So it's real history of many people at that time. Yeah.
Casper.
I was struck, you mentioned that the Museum of Jewish Antiquities had right from the outset a sector for daily life. In a European context, this is, I mean, it's a big topic now in archaeology, but in a European context, this was highly unusual in museums to have such a big area allocated to everyday life. But again, in a way, it's not surprising when we think of how Sukenik defined archaeology or Jewish archaeology. Do you think there is a case to be made that Jewish archaeology developed a distinctive way, methodological approach to everyday life already from an early date onwards?
It's really interesting. I mean, what you said. I mean, when I say that he's going, I mean, he has interest in daily life. I just quoted from the letter what he wrote. I mean, this is something that I cannot deny. That was his idea. As I mentioned in my lecture, he spent 2 years in Berlin, studied in Berlin. And some people then criticize him, that's in the evaluation letter, that he's going in a different direction in his research, influenced by all sorts of ideas that have been developed in 20th century, in the 20th in Germany. I don't know, I mean, I have to think about it. I mean, really have to go more into details with regard to your question, but I think the way I see, I mean, through his writing, when he refers to daily life, it's not in the sense of we today referring to daily life. I think he wanted to focus on certain elements that connected with, for example, agriculture or clothing. And it's today we call it daily life. I also have to go back to the Hebrew and to check the translation. But I think, I don't know, I have to check it and I have to think about it and to see whether you're right in your point or it should be rephrased differently. Yes.
Professor, given the unprecedented nature of what Sukenik was doing, when he found objects, was he able to consult with other people at the university, or did he have to go to other countries, or how did he develop an understanding of what he was finding?
I said it was self-teaching. And it's a different environment, different time, different era. You didn't consult. He was the He wouldn't dream of consulting.
He just made it up. He found it.
Different. You have to think about it differently. But he did travel. I mean, he did travel to Europe many times for long journey, mainly because he needed libraries. There was no library. I mean, the library was really very restricted. So he traveled. I am sure he met people, and he did meet people. And for example, Avon Bichler in London, and other people he meets and speak with them. But it's more in a broader sense. I mean, when he found something, I mean, it's really struck me when I read the Bet Alpha publication, the book. I read it many times in the past, but I reread it now, and I was really amazed by the level of his knowledge. I mean, the way he really was, and I don't think he didn't get any information for anybody. I mean, this is the way he perceived it. I mean, he read articles, he was updated, but that's the way he really worked, on his own. And that's something that it's so different from today.
Just to follow on that question, is it really implausible to imagine that Sukenik had an intellectual, social life? One of the letters is dated Rehavia. So was he not part of the community?
No, definitely he was. Yeah,
so did he not go for walks and talk about his finds with the philologists?
Yes, I'm sure he did. And I'm sure they discussed it, but she didn't ask about epigraphy and literature as an object. No one in his milieu was able to, I mean, he did. With Ludwig Meyer, he spoke, he was an Arabist, and also with some classicists. I'm sure he conversed, I'm sure he discussed with people, but it's not like because he was a mature, so he needed help from other people. And he studied with Orpite, with Vincent, and he came in contact with many people, but in working on the publication, he did it on his own. I mean, there was a big community in Jerusalem. You have to realize, let me just expand on this in a few sentences. Jerusalem in the 20s, 30s, when there was the Hebrew University, was something not so big, but expanded at the time. Then there was the schools, the American school, the French school, the German schools, and scholars came from Germany, England, or Germany at one point they left, but and those people, mostly theologian, not real archaeologists. Even Vincent was an archaeologist, we consider him as an archaeologist, but he was a theologian. And so there was a community, archaeological community in the city, with whom he could meet, speak, and we know that he collaborated. But in terms of his academic work, I think he worked really on his own.
I think we have time for one more question. Colin?
Given the university context, I'm really curious how students fit into his life and his work. Is there any evidence of his relationships with students, or sort of how his work impacted them? Or sort of what's your sense of him as a teacher?
They say he wasn't a great teacher. But and number of students was very small. I mean, you talk about less than 10. They did travel with him for excavations. And I mentioned Nachman Avigad started as an assistant, he was a student. And so they went with him. But classes, how the classes were taken, I don't know. I don't know if we have much information. I mean, there are all sorts of reconstruction. For example, there's a book written by Neil Silberman, who wrote a biography on Sukenik son, Yigael Yadin. And over there, he tried to give the impression of the department, because Yadin studied also with his father, but most of the time did not study with his father, with the other professor. So over there, he implemented that there were simple classes where there were presentation, I mean, studying the material, but nothing beyond that. So I don't think we have much evidence. I mean, we don't have real notes from students or anything that was written later on that you can really deduce from that. But he had students. I mean, there's evidence for students, and some of the pictures that I brought are Sukenik with students. And also the environment, I mean, with the few pictures that are left, I mean, it wasn't a real classroom like that. I mean, it's more, I mean, sitting together, studying, but I really don't know. I don't think we have enough evidence to answer these type of questions.
Thank you.
So we'll stop there for now. I invite you back over the next